The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the small boarding house, and Julia Emerson pressed her hand against the worn leather seat to steady herself as dust billowed through the open window. Wallace, Idaho stretched before her in the afternoon sun of July 1883, a mining town carved into the mountains with buildings that looked as weathered as the faces of the men who built them. She stepped down onto the dirt street with her single carpetbag, knowing she was arriving at what felt like the end of the world, the end of everything she had once dreamed her life would be. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Holloway, was a stout woman with kind eyes who asked no questions when Julia paid for a month in advance with money she had saved from selling her mother's jewelry. The room was small and spare, but it had a window that looked out over the mountains, and that was enough. Julia sat on the narrow bed and let herself cry for the first time since leaving St. Louis 3 weeks ago. She cried for the husband who had cast her aside after 5 years of marriage when no child came. She cried for the doctor's words that still echoed in her mind, clinical and cold, explaining that her body was flawed, incapable of the one thing a woman was supposed to do. She cried for the shame that had driven her from her home, from the pitying looks of neighbors who whispered behind their hands about barren women and worthless wives. When the tears finally stopped, Julia washed her face in the basin and looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand. She was 24 years old, still young by any measure, but she felt ancient. Her dark hair needed pinning, her green eyes were red-rimmed, and her dress was rumpled from travel. She forced herself to stand straighter. Wallace was a place where people came to start over, to seek fortunes in silver mines, to escape pasts that chased them. She would find work, she would make a life, and she would learn to live with the hollow feeling in her chest where hope used to live. The next morning, Julia walked through town asking about employment. The saloon keeper laughed in her face when she inquired about washing dishes. The general store owner told her his wife handled all the help they needed. The milliner looked her up and down and said she did not have the cheerful disposition required to sell hats. By noon, Julia's feet hurt and her pride was thoroughly trampled. She sat on a bench outside the assay office and considered her dwindling funds. She had perhaps 2 months before desperation would force her into choices she did not want to contemplate. "You look like you could use some lunch." The voice was male, deep and gentle, and Julia looked up to see a man standing a respectful distance away, hat in his hands. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were blue, the color of the sky over these mountains, and they held genuine concern rather than the assessment she had grown used to from men. "I did not mean to startle you, madam. I am Wyatt Ramsey. I run a horse ranch about 3 miles north of town. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you were new to Wallace and looking for work." Julia stood, smoothing her skirt. "Julia Emerson, and yes, I am looking for work, though I am having little success." Wyatt Ramsey turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that seemed more thoughtful than nervous. "I have a proposition that might interest you, if you would allow me to buy you lunch while I explain. The hotel dining room is respectable, and I promise this is a legitimate offer of employment." Something in his straightforward manner made Julia agree. They walked to the hotel, and Wyatt held the door for her, nodding to several people who called greetings to him. Clearly, he was well known in town. They sat at a table near the window, and the waitress brought them coffee and took their orders for roast chicken and potatoes. "Here is my situation," Wyatt began, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "I have been running my ranch alone for 3 years now, since my parents passed from influenza. I have got about 200 acres, 40 horses at present, and more work than one person can handle. I need help with the household tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending, that sort of thing. I also need someone who can help with the account books, as numbers were never my strong suit. The pay would be $30 a month, plus room and board in a separate cabin on the property. It is not fancy, but it is solid and private. Julia studied him carefully. Why are you offering this to a stranger? Surely there are women in town who would take such a position. Wyatt met her eyes steadily. Mrs. Halloway is a good judge of character. She said you seemed like someone who needed honest work and a safe place to land. As for the women in town, most of them either have families to care for or have made their feelings known that ranch life is too isolated and rough. I need someone who is not afraid of hard work and who values privacy. Mrs. Halloway thought you might be that person. The offer was almost too good to be true, which made Julia suspicious. Mr. Ramsey, I must be plain with you. I am recently separated from my husband. The separation was not amicable, and it was because I cannot have children. If you are looking for someone to eventually become more than an employee, I am not the woman for that position. Something flickered across Wyatt's face, perhaps surprise at her bluntness, but his expression remained kind. Mrs. Emerson, I am looking for help with my ranch, nothing more. Your personal history is your own business. I am offering employment, a fair wage and respectful treatment. If that interests you, I would be glad to have your help. If not, I understand. Julia felt tension she had not realized she was carrying ease slightly from her shoulders. I would like to see the property before I decide, if that is acceptable. Of course. I brought the wagon to town for supplies. We could drive out after lunch if you are willing. They ate their meal with less awkwardness than Julia had expected. Wyatt talked about his horses, about the challenges of ranching in Idaho's mountain country, about the harsh winters and beautiful summers. He spoke with the passion of someone who loved his work, and Julia found herself relaxing in his presence. He asked her polite questions about her journey west, and she gave him the sanitized version, leaving out the ugliest parts. After lunch, Wyatt helped her into a sturdy wagon loaded with supplies, and they drove north out of Wallace. The road wound through pine forests and opened into valleys where wildflowers bloomed in riots of color. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat in the valley. Julia had lived her whole life in cities, and the vast openness of this landscape made her feel simultaneously small and strangely freed. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road. The main house was a solid log structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney. A large barn stood nearby, and Julia could see horses grazing in a fenced pasture beyond. Gardens grew near the house, vegetables and herbs thriving in neat rows. About 50 yards from the main house stood a smaller cabin, one room by the look of it, with its own small porch and a stone chimney. That would be your cabin, Wyatt said, pulling the wagon to a stop. It was originally built for my grandfather when my parents took over the main house. He lived there until he passed about 10 years ago. I have been using it for storage, but I cleaned it out last week on the chance I might find someone to hire. It needs some work to make it comfortable, but the roof is sound and the chimney draws well. Julia climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the cabin. Wyatt followed at a respectful distance, letting her explore. The door opened smoothly, and inside she found a single large room with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. There was a narrow bed frame in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a chest of drawers. Windows on 2 walls let in light and provided views of the mountains. The floor was rough-hewn planks, but they were solid. The walls were chinked logs, weathered but sturdy. It is not much, Wyatt said from the doorway, but you would have complete privacy. I would expect you at the main house by 6 in the morning to start breakfast, and your duties would generally end after supper is cleaned up, around 7 in the evening. Sundays would be your own, and if you needed to go into town for any reason, you could use one of the horses or I could drive you in the wagon. Julia turned to face him. The cabin was rough, but it was clean and it was hers alone. The idea of having her own space, of not being dependent on the charity of a boarding house or the suffocating oversight of family, made her throat tight. I would like to accept your offer, Mr. Ramsey. When would you like me to start? If you need time to settle in, I understand. Perhaps Monday. That gives you 3 days. Monday is perfect. Julia held out her hand and Wyatt shook it firmly. His hand was calloused and strong, the hand of a man who worked hard every day, and the handshake was brief and professional. They drove back to town, and Wyatt helped her collect her belongings from the boarding house. Mrs. Halloway smiled and wished her well, pressing a loaf of fresh bread into Julia's hands. "Wyatt Ramsey is a good man," she said quietly. "You will be safe there." The words meant more to Julia than the older woman could have known. Safety had been in short supply for a long time. The first weeks at the ranch established a rhythm that Julia found unexpectedly comforting. She woke before dawn in her little cabin, washed in cold water from the pump outside, dressed in the simple work dresses she had brought west, and walked through the cool morning air to the main house. She learned that Wyatt liked his coffee strong and his breakfast hearty, eggs and bacon and biscuits with gravy. He ate quickly, thanked her sincerely, and headed out to work with the horses while she cleaned up the breakfast dishes and began the day's other tasks. The main house had clearly been neglected in the domestic department. Dust lay thick on surfaces, mending was piled in baskets, and the account books were a disaster of smudged figures and missing entries. Julia threw herself into the work with something approaching relief. Here, at least, she could see the results of her labor. Here, she could make a tangible difference. She scrubbed and organized and mended and cooked, and slowly the house began to look like a home rather than just a place where a man slept between long days of work. Wyatt was unfailingly polite and respectful. He never entered her cabin uninvited. He never stood too close or let his eyes linger. He thanked her for every meal, complimented her cooking genuinely, and seemed sincerely appreciative of the order she brought to his household. He worked from dawn until well past dusk, training horses, mending fences, hauling feed, doing the endless labor that kept a ranch running. Julia often watched him from the kitchen window, saw the patient way he worked with a skittish horse, the easy strength with which he lifted heavy saddles, the care he took with every task. In the evenings, after supper was finished and cleaned up, Julia sometimes sat on her cabin porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The quiet was profound, broken only by the sounds of horses in the pasture, the wind in the pines, the occasional call of an owl. She had thought she would feel lonely in such isolation, but instead she felt something closer to peace. There was no one here to judge her, no one to whisper about her failures as a woman. She was simply Julia, doing work that mattered, earning her own keep. One evening in early August, about a month after she had arrived, a summer storm rolled over the mountains. Julia was reading by lamplight in her cabin when thunder began to rumble and lightning flickered across the sky. She loved storms, always had, and she stood on her porch to watch the display. The rain came in a sudden deluge, and she was about to step back inside when she saw Wyatt running from the barn toward the main house, soaked to the skin. He saw her watching and changed direction, jogging over to her porch. "Sorry to disturb you," he called over the sound of the rain. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. These storms can be fierce, and I know you are not used to mountain weather." "I am fine," Julia called back. "Do you want to wait out the worst of it here? You are already soaked." Wyatt hesitated, then climbed onto the porch, water streaming from his hair and clothes. "I will just stand here a minute to catch my breath. I do not want to drip all over your floor." Lightning cracked close by, illuminating the landscape in stark white light, and thunder followed almost immediately. Julia jumped despite herself, and Wyatt steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then immediately released her. "Sorry, that was close." "I love storms," Julia said, wrapping her arms around herself. "They make me feel alive." Wyatt looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are braver than most, then. Many folks around here hide in their cellars when storms like this blow through." They stood in companionable silence, watching the lightning dance across the mountains. The storm began to ease after about 20 minutes, the thunder moving off into the distance, the rain settling into a steady shower. Wyatt stepped down from the porch. "Thank you for the shelter. I should get back and change into dry clothes. I will see you in the morning." "Good night, Mr. Ramsey." "Wyatt," he said, turning back. "We have been working together for a month now. I think we can dispense with the formalities, if you are comfortable with that." "Wyatt," Julia agreed. "And you should call me Julia." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "Good night, Julia." As the summer progressed, Julia found herself looking forward to the small moments of conversation with Wyatt. They talked over breakfast about the horses he was training, about the weather, about plans for the ranch. He asked her opinion on things, actually listened to her answers, and sometimes changed his plans based on her suggestions. It had been so long since anyone had valued her thoughts that Julia found herself blossoming under the simple respect he showed her. In September, Wyatt asked if she would help him at a horse auction in Wallace. "I need someone to handle the paperwork and keep track of the bidding while I assess the stock. It would be a long day, but I would pay you extra for the time." Julia agreed, and they rode into town together in the wagon on a crisp autumn morning. The auction was held in a large corral near the train depot, and dozens of horses were run through, while buyers called out bids. Julia sat at a small table with a ledger, recording every transaction, while Wyatt moved through the crowd, examining horses, talking with other ranchers, and occasionally bidding himself. He bought 3 young mares with good lines, paying fair prices for each. During a break in the auction, they ate lunch together at a small restaurant. A woman approached their table, middle-aged and expensively dressed. "Wyatt Ramsey, I heard you were back in town. How are you managing out at that ranch all alone?" "I am doing well, Mrs. Patterson." "May I introduce Julia Emerson? She has been helping me run the household." Mrs. Patterson's eyes swept over Julia with the kind of assessment Julia had learned to dread. "How modern. And are you married, Miss Emerson?" "Mrs. Emerson," Julia corrected quietly. "I am separated from my husband." "I see." The 2 words carried volumes of judgment. "Well, Wyatt, you know my niece Caroline is still unmarried, such a sweet girl, and she comes from excellent family. You really should consider settling down properly. A man needs sons to help with a ranch." Wyatt's expression remained polite, but his voice cooled noticeably. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Patterson, but my arrangements are my own business. If you will excuse us, we need to finish our lunch before the auction resumes." The woman sniffed and walked away. Julia stared at her plate, her appetite gone. The words "a man needs sons" echoed in her head, a reminder of everything she could never provide. "Julia." Wyatt's voice was gentle. "Please do not let her bother you. Mrs. Patterson is the town gossip and considers it her personal mission to see everyone married off according to her specifications." "She is right, though," Julia said quietly. You should marry someone who can give you children, someone who is not damaged. Wyatt set down his fork with enough force to make a slight clatter. You are not damaged. Do not let anyone, including yourself, tell you that you are. Julia looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. His blue eyes were fierce. You do not understand. I cannot have children. My husband divorced me because I failed in the most basic requirement of being a wife. I am worthless as a woman. Stop. Wyatt reached across the table and took her hand, a brief touch that he released immediately, but the contact sent warmth through Julia's arm. You are not worthless. You are intelligent, hardworking, kind, and capable. You have taken my chaotic household and turned it into a home. You have saved me hours of frustration with the account books. You make the best biscuits I have ever tasted. Those things have worth. You have worth. Julia felt tears prick her eyes. Why are you being so kind to me? Because it is the truth. Wyatt held her gaze. And because I think you have been told lies for too long. They finished their lunch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, weighted with things unsaid. Julia's heart beat faster than it should, and she warned herself sternly not to read too much into Wyatt's words. He was a good man, a kind employer, nothing more. She could not let herself hope for anything beyond that. The autumn deepened, and Julia helped Wyatt prepare the ranch for winter. They harvested the garden together, Julia preserving vegetables while Wyatt dug potatoes and squash. They worked side by side cutting and stacking firewood, Julia insisting she could help despite Wyatt's protests that it was too heavy work. She proved herself capable, and Wyatt eventually accepted her help with good grace. One evening in late October, Julia invited Wyatt to her cabin for supper. She had been practicing a recipe for apple pie, and she wanted to surprise him. He arrived at her door looking uncertain. Are you sure this is appropriate? I do not want to compromise your reputation. Wyatt, we live on an isolated ranch. I am already a separated woman living alone on your property. My reputation cannot be much more compromised. Besides, I made pie. He grinned. Pie is a compelling argument. Julia had set her small table with care, using wildflowers in a jar as a centerpiece. She served roast chicken with vegetables and fresh bread, and Wyatt ate with genuine appreciation. They talked more freely than usual, perhaps because they were in neutral territory rather than employer and employee sharing a meal in his house. Wyatt told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents who had been deeply in love until the day they died within hours of each other from the same illness. Julia found herself telling him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her father who had been a banker and her mother who had loved music. Why did you marry your husband? Wyatt asked, then immediately looked apologetic. I am sorry, that is too personal. No, it is all right. Julia poured them both more coffee. I married him because he seemed kind and because my father approved of him. I thought I loved him in the beginning. But when the years passed and no children came, he changed. He became cold, then cruel. He consulted doctors who examined me like I was livestock. When the last doctor said I was barren, my husband told me he wanted an annulment. He said he had married me to have a family, and since I could not provide that, there was no point in continuing the marriage. He was a fool. Wyatt's voice was hard. Marriage is supposed to be about partnership, about choosing to build a life with someone. Children are a blessing if they come, but they are not the only measure of a marriage's worth. Most people do not see it that way. Most people are wrong about a lot of things. Wyatt met her eyes across the small table. Julia, I want to tell you something, and I hope you will not take it the wrong way. Julia's heart began to beat faster. All right. I have come to care for you, not just as my employee, but as a person I respect and admire. These past few months, having you here, they have been the happiest I have been since my parents died. You have brought life back to this place." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I am not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that you are valued here. You are seen. And if you ever wanted to stay for reasons beyond employment, I would be honored." Julia's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "Wyatt, I cannot give you children. I know. You say that now, but eventually you would resent me. You would look at other men with their sons helping on their ranches, and you would regret being tied to a barren woman." Wyatt stood and walked around the table, kneeling beside her chair so he could look up into her face. "Julia, listen to me. I am 30 years old. If having children was the most important thing in my life, I would have married years ago. I have had opportunities, but I never found someone I wanted to build a life with, until now. You barely know me. I know that you work hard without complaint. I know that you are brave enough to travel across the country alone to start over. I know that you are kind to the horses, that you laugh at my bad jokes, that you watch storms without fear. I know that you make my house feel like a home. I know that when I see you walking across the yard in the morning light, my whole day feels brighter. If that is not enough to build on, I do not know what is." Julia felt tears streaming down her face. "I am broken, Wyatt. You are not broken. You are enough just as you stand here." He took her hands gently. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am just asking if you would consider the possibility, if you would let yourself think about a future here that is more than just employment." Julia looked into his honest blue eyes and saw no deception, no hidden agenda. She saw a good man offering her something she had thought lost forever, a chance at love, at partnership, at a life that was not defined by what she could not do but by what she could be. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like that very much." Wyatt smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Good. Then we will take our time and see where this goes. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people getting to know each other." He stood and helped her to her feet, then stepped back to a respectful distance. "I should go and let you get some rest. Thank you for the supper and the pie. Both were perfect." After he left, Julia sat at her table for a long time, her hands pressed to her chest where her heart was doing strange, fluttering things. She had come to Idaho expecting nothing more than a place to hide from her pain. She had found work, safety, and a home. Now, impossibly, she had found the possibility of something more. The courtship that developed between Julia and Wyatt was slow and sweet. He began leaving small gifts for her: wildflowers on her porch, a hair ribbon in a color that matched her eyes, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. She responded by making his favorite foods, by mending his clothes with extra care, by leaving notes in his lunch pail that made him smile. They began taking evening walks together when the weather allowed, strolling around the ranch property while Wyatt pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land. He held her hand, a simple gesture that made Julia's heart race every time. They talked about everything: their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. Wyatt spoke about expanding the ranch, about developing a reputation for quality horses. Julia admitted that she had always wanted to learn to ride properly, and Wyatt immediately offered to teach her. The riding lessons became a cherished part of their routine. Wyatt was patient and encouraging, never making Julia feel foolish when she struggled to master the basics. He chose a gentle mare named Daisy for her to learn on, and Julia gradually grew confident in the saddle. There was something freeing about riding across the open land, the wind in her hair, the power of the horse beneath her. Wyatt rode beside her, always watchful but never overprotective, and his pride in her progress was evident. November brought the first serious snow. Julia woke one morning to find her cabin surrounded by white. The world transformed overnight. She bundled into her warmest clothes and trudged through the snow to the main house, arriving to find Wyatt already up and stoking the fire in the kitchen stove. "This is just the beginning," he said, pouring her coffee. "By January, we will have snowdrifts higher than your head. I hope you are prepared for a long winter." "I have never experienced a real winter," Julia admitted. "St. Louis had snow, but nothing like this." "Then I will teach you." Wyatt's eyes were warm. "Winter in the mountains is harsh, but it has its own beauty. You will see." He was right. As the weeks passed and the snow deepened, Julia discovered the stark beauty of the landscape. The mountains glittered white against blue skies. Icicles hung from the eaves like crystal chandeliers. The nights were bitterly cold, but her cabin stayed warm with a good fire, and Julia wrapped herself in quilts and watched the stars through her window, brighter than she had ever seen them. Christmas approached, and Julia decided to make the holiday special. She had saved enough from her wages to buy fabric in town, and she spent her evenings secretly sewing a new shirt for Wyatt, dark blue that would match his eyes. She baked for days, filling tins with cookies and candies. On Christmas Eve, she decorated the main house with pine boughs and ribbons, and she cooked a feast: roast beef, potatoes, vegetables from the preserves, fresh bread, and 3 kinds of pie. Wyatt arrived for supper looking stunned at the transformation of his house. "Julia, this is incredible. You did not have to do all this. I wanted to. It has been years since I had a real Christmas. I wanted to celebrate." They ate slowly, savoring the meal and each other's company. After supper, they sat in front of the fireplace in the main room, and Julia shyly presented her gift. Wyatt unwrapped the shirt with careful hands, and when he held it up, his expression was soft with emotion. "Julia, this is beautiful. You made this. I am not the best seamstress, but I tried. It is perfect." He folded the shirt carefully and set it aside, then reached behind his chair and pulled out a wrapped package. "I have something for you, too." Julia unwrapped the gift to find a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "Wyatt, this is too much." "It is not. I have noticed you writing sometimes in the evenings. I thought you might like a proper journal for your thoughts." He paused, looking suddenly nervous. "There is something else." From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box. Julia's breath caught. Wyatt opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small green stone. "This was my grandmother's ring. The stone is a peridot, mined right here in Idaho. I know it is too soon and I am not officially proposing, but I wanted you to have this as a promise. A promise that I am serious about a future together, if that is what you want." Julia's hands trembled as she took the box. "Wyatt, are you sure? You could have any woman you wanted, someone whole, someone who could give you everything." Wyatt took her face gently in his hands. "Julia Emerson, you are whole. You are everything I want. I do not care about children except as a possibility we could explore together through other means if we chose. There are orphans who need homes, children who need parents. But even if we never had children, even if it was just the two of us forever, that would be enough. You are enough." Julia felt something break open in her chest, some hard shell of pain and shame that had encased her heart for years. She threw her arms around Wyatt's neck and kissed him, a desperate, grateful kiss that he returned with gentle passion. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Is that a yes?" Wyatt asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes. Yes to a future together. Yes to taking that leap of faith. Yes to you." Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They sat together by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, and Julia felt truly happy for the first time in years. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. They were married in February, a simple ceremony in the small church in Wallace with Mrs. Halloway and the minister's wife as witnesses. Julia wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant in deep green silk. Wyatt wore the blue shirt she had made him for Christmas. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but when Wyatt said, "I do," and slipped a gold band onto her finger beside his grandmother's ring, Julia knew she was making the best decision of her life. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, and a surprising number of townspeople turned out to wish them well. Mrs. Patterson attended, her expression pinched with disapproval, but Julia found she did not care. Let the woman gossip. Julia knew the truth of her marriage, the love and respect that formed its foundation. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and Wyatt carried her over the threshold of the main house. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ramsey," Julia laughed, giddy with happiness. "It feels strange to be called that." "You will get used to it." Wyatt set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this decision. I could never regret marrying you." That night, Wyatt was gentle and patient, understanding that Julia's previous experience of marriage bed had not been loving. He took his time, murmuring reassurances, showing her that intimacy could be tender and joyful rather than a cold duty. Julia discovered that her body could respond with pleasure, that she could lose herself in sensation without fear. Afterward, lying in Wyatt's arms in the big bed that was now theirs together, she felt cherished in a way she had never experienced. The spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted in rushing streams, wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, and the horses grew frisky with the warmer weather. Julia threw herself into ranch life with new energy, working alongside Wyatt in ways that went beyond her original domestic duties. She learned to help with the horses, to assist with foaling, to recognize signs of illness or injury in the stock. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Wyatt brought up a subject they had been carefully avoiding. "Julia, I want to talk about children, not because I need them, but because I want to make sure you know all the options." Julia tensed. "What do you mean?" "There is an orphanage in Spokane. I have been corresponding with them. There are dozens of children there who need homes. Some are babies, some are older. If we wanted to provide a home for a child, we could. But only if you want to. I do not want you to feel pressured." Julia felt tears spring to her eyes. "You would do that? Take in someone else's child? Why not? A child who needs love does not care whether they share our blood. They just need a family." Wyatt took her hand. "But I need you to be sure. I need to know this is something you want, not something you are doing because you think you owe it to me." Julia thought about it for a long moment. The old pain was still there, the grief over the children her body could not create. But alongside it was something new, hope. The possibility that she could be a mother, that she could give love and receive it, regardless of biology. "I think I would like that," she said slowly. "Not right away. I want us to have more time together first, just the two of us. But yes, someday I would like to open our home to a child who needs one." Wyatt pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Then we will do it when the time is right. There is no rush." The summer was busy and productive. Wyatt's reputation for training quality horses grew, and buyers came from as far as Montana to purchase stock from the Ramsey Ranch. Julia handled all the paperwork and correspondence, her neat handwriting and careful bookkeeping impressing buyers and earning Wyatt's grateful praise. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, young men from town who were respectful and hardworking. In the autumn of 1884, more than a year after Julia had first arrived in Wallace, She brought up the subject of the orphanage again. "I think I am ready," she told Wyatt one evening. "I think I am ready to meet the children." They made the journey to Spokane in November, a long trip that took 3 days by train. The orphanage was a large brick building on the outskirts of the city, run by a nun named Sister Margaret who had kind eyes and work-worn hands. She led them through corridors where children of all ages played and studied and did chores. "We have many children who need homes," Sister Margaret said. "Some are infants surrendered by mothers who could not care for them. Some are older children whose parents died from illness or accident. All of them deserve love and stability." Julia felt overwhelmed by the sea of small faces, each one representing a story of loss and hope. They visited the nursery first, where babies cooed and cried in neat rows of cribs. Julia held a tiny girl who could not have been more than a month old, and her heart contracted with fierce longing. But something made her hesitate. These babies would be easy to love, but there were older children here who had less chance of finding families. "Could we meet some of the older children?" Julia asked. Sister Margaret looked pleased. "Of course. Most families want infants. The older children are often overlooked." They were introduced to children of various ages. A 6-year-old boy named Timothy who was shy but had a beautiful smile. A pair of sisters, 8 and 10, who held hands and looked at the world with wary eyes. A 12-year-old girl named Sarah who helped care for the younger children and had a maturity beyond her years. But it was a 4-year-old boy who captured Julia's heart. His name was Daniel, and he had dark curly hair and solemn brown eyes. He stood apart from the other children, watching but not participating in their games. Sister Margaret explained that Daniel's parents had died in a fire 6 months earlier. He had been withdrawn since arriving at the orphanage, speaking rarely, playing even less. Julia knelt in front of Daniel. "Hello, my name is Julia. What are you building there?" Daniel looked at the wooden blocks in his hands, then at Julia. "A house," he said quietly. "That is a good house. It looks strong." "It will not burn down," Daniel said with heartbreaking seriousness. Julia felt tears threaten but kept her voice steady. "No, it will not. Would you like to tell me about your house?" Slowly, haltingly, Daniel began to talk. He told her about the house he was building, how it would have a big kitchen and lots of windows. Julia listened, asking gentle questions, and Wyatt crouched beside her, equally attentive. By the end of the visit, Daniel was showing them his other creations, his small face animated in a way Sister Margaret said she had not seen since his arrival. On the train ride home, Julia and Wyatt talked long into the night. "I know he is older than we discussed," Julia said, "and he comes with trauma we will need to help him work through, but Wyatt, I cannot stop thinking about him." "I cannot either," Wyatt admitted. "He is a brave little boy who has suffered a terrible loss. If we can give him a safe, loving home, help him heal, I think we should." They returned to Spokane 2 weeks later with a letter from the local minister vouching for their character and proof of their ability to provide for a child. The adoption process was simpler than Julia had expected. Sister Margaret clearly believed they would be good parents, and she expedited the paperwork. They spent 3 days at a boarding house near the orphanage, visiting Daniel daily so he could get used to the idea of coming home with them. On the 4th day, they left Spokane with Daniel between them on the train, clutching a small bag of belongings and looking terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Julia held his hand and pointed out interesting sights through the window, while Wyatt told him stories about the horses he would meet at the ranch. Bringing Daniel home was both wonderful and challenging. He was a quiet child, polite but reserved, and he startled easily at loud noises. Julia and Wyatt were patient, giving him space to adjust, never pushing. They set up a room for him in the main house, letting him choose how to arrange his few possessions. Julia read to him every night before bed, and slowly Daniel began to relax. The horses proved to be therapeutic. Daniel was fascinated by them, and Wyatt spent hours teaching him how to approach them, how to brush them, how to speak to them softly. Watching Wyatt with Daniel, patient and gentle and encouraging, made Julia fall even more in love with her husband. He was a natural father, and Daniel blossomed under his attention. By spring, Daniel was laughing regularly. He followed Wyatt everywhere, his small shadow, chattering about horses and asking endless questions. He helped Julia in the garden, his small hands surprisingly capable. At night, he hugged both of them and whispered "good night, Mama," and "good night, Papa," in a way that made Julia's heart overflow. One morning in June of 1885, nearly 2 years after Julia had first arrived in Wallace, she stood on the porch of the main house watching Wyatt teach Daniel how to sit properly on a gentle old mare. The sun was warm, the mountains were green with summer growth, and the sound of Daniel's delighted laughter rang across the yard. Julia pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the fullness of joy there. Wyatt looked over and saw her watching. He said something to Daniel, then walked over to the porch, leaving their son happily petting the horse. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Julia smiled. "I was thinking about the day I arrived here, how lost I was, how convinced I was that my life was over. I was wrong about everything. My life was just beginning." Wyatt climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms. "I remember seeing you for the first time, sitting outside the assay office looking like your world had ended. I remember thinking you were the saddest, most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I am glad I worked up the courage to speak to you." "I am glad you did too." Julia kissed him softly. "You saved me, Wyatt. You and Daniel both. You showed me that I was not broken, just bent. You helped me straighten back out." "You saved yourself," Wyatt corrected. "You had the courage to keep going, to try again, to let yourself hope. All I did was see what was already there." Daniel called from the pasture, "Papa, come watch. I can pat her all by myself." Wyatt kissed Julia's forehead. "Duty calls." "Are you happy, Julia? Truly happy?" Julia looked at the life she had built, at the husband who loved her without conditions, at the son they had chosen to raise together. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." She watched Wyatt jog back to Daniel, watched him lift the boy onto his shoulders and spin him around while Daniel shrieked with laughter. The sound echoed across the ranch, a sound of pure joy that erased all the years of pain and shame. Julia had arrived in Wallace expecting to hide from the world, to live a half-life on the edges of society. Instead, she had found a full life, rich with love and purpose and belonging. The years that followed were not without challenges. Ranch life was hard and winters were brutal. There were years when money was tight, when horses fell ill, when storms destroyed fences and buildings that took months to repair. But Julia and Wyatt faced every challenge as partners, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the good times together. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father did. When he was 7, Julia and Wyatt returned to the orphanage in Spokane and adopted a 5-year-old girl named Emma, who had been abandoned as an infant and had spent her whole life in the orphanage. Emma was tiny and fierce, with red hair and green eyes, and she attached herself to Julia immediately, following her everywhere and mimicking her actions. Adding Emma to their family was another adjustment, but it filled the house with even more laughter and life. Daniel was protective of his little sister, teaching her everything he knew, and Emma worshipped him in return. Julia often stood in the doorway watching her children play, marveling at the fact that she was someone's mother, that she had not just one child but two, that her house was full of the noise and chaos and love of a family. In 1889, when Daniel was 9 and Emma was 7, Julia discovered that her body had performed an impossible miracle. She was pregnant. The doctor in Wallace was skeptical when she first came to him with her symptoms, given her history, but he confirmed it after examination. Julia was pregnant, against all medical odds, against everything she had been told was possible. She told Wyatt that night after the children were in bed, barely able to believe the words coming out of her own mouth. Wyatt's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally pure joy. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, his hands hovering protectively. "Are you all right? Should you be standing? Do you need to sit down?" Julia laughed through her tears. "I am fine. I am perfectly healthy. The doctor says everything looks normal, but it will be a cautious pregnancy given my age and history." "We will be cautious," Wyatt promised. "We will do everything right." "But Julia, whether this baby comes or not, whether your body can carry to term or not, it does not change anything about my love for you. You know that, right?" "I know." And she did know, deep in her bones. If she lost this pregnancy, it would be devastating, but it would not destroy her. She had already built a life full of love and meaning. This baby would be an addition to their family, a bonus, not the validation of her worth as a woman. She had already proven her worth in 1,000 other ways. The pregnancy was difficult. Julia was sick frequently in the early months, and the doctor ordered her to rest more than her nature wanted to allow. Wyatt hired a young woman from town to help with the housework and cooking, and both Daniel and Emma stepped up to take on more responsibilities. They were excited about the prospect of a baby, Emma especially, who talked constantly about all the things she would teach the new brother or sister. On a snowy February morning in 1890, Julia went into labor. The doctor was called, and he arrived along with Mrs. Holloway, who had experience as a midwife. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Julia was terrified that something would go wrong, that she would lose this baby she had already come to love so fiercely. But at dawn, after hours of effort, Julia heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby crying. The doctor held up a squirming, red-faced infant. "It is a boy, and he has got a fine set of lungs." Wyatt was at Julia's side immediately, tears streaming down his face. The doctor placed the baby in Julia's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair, the eyes that would eventually settle into a color but for now were a murky blue. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas, after Wyatt's father, and he completed their family in a way Julia had not known was missing. Daniel and Emma were fascinated by their baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him, who got to help feed him, who got to rock him when he cried. Wyatt was a doting father, staying up with Julia for late-night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with a fussy baby so Julia could rest. As Julia recovered from the birth and adjusted to life with an infant again, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her, on that hot July day in 1883 when she arrived in Wallace broken and hopeless, that within 7 years she would have a loving husband, 3 children, and a thriving ranch, she would never have believed them. The path had not been easy, but every step had been worth it. One evening when Thomas was about 6 months old, Julia sat on the porch with the baby in her arms while Wyatt and the older children did evening chores. Mrs. Patterson happened to be driving by the ranch with her husband, and they stopped to offer congratulations on the new baby. Mrs. Patterson looked at Thomas, then at Julia, and there was something almost like respect in her eyes. "Well, Mrs. Ramsey, it seems you have been blessed after all. 3 children. Your husband must be very proud." Julia looked the older woman directly in the eye. "My husband was proud before this baby came. He is proud of our family not just because of the children, but because of the love we have built together. That is what matters." Mrs. Patterson blinked, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. I wish you well, Julia. Your family is fortunate to have you." After they drove away, Wyatt came over and sat beside Julia on the porch steps. What did Mrs. Patterson want? To see the baby, and maybe to revise her opinion of our marriage. Wyatt laughed and kissed her temple. Her opinion never mattered. Only ours did. Daniel came running up with Emma close behind. "Papa, can we go fishing tomorrow? You promised we could go when you had time." "I did promise, did not I? All right, we will go fishing tomorrow. Your mother can have a quiet day with Thomas while we catch our supper." Emma climbed into Julia's lap beside the baby. "I want to stay with Mama and Thomas. I do not like fishing. The worms are slimy." Julia hugged her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling Thomas's warm weight in her other arm. "Then you and I will bake cookies while the boys go fishing. How does that sound?" "Perfect." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Julia looked around at her family. Wyatt with his hand on Daniel's shoulder, discussing the best fishing spots. Emma curled against Julia's side, already making plans for the next day's baking. Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny hand curled into a fist. This was her life, the life she had built from the ashes of her old existence. It was not the life she had planned or expected, but it was infinitely better than anything she had imagined. The years continued to pass in the rhythm of ranch life. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and passions. Daniel became an excellent horseman, working alongside Wyatt from a young age and showing real talent for training. Emma proved to be gifted with figures, taking over the account books from Julia when she was only 12 and managing them with impressive skill. Thomas was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of trouble and make everyone laugh. Julia expanded her role on the ranch, taking charge of breeding decisions and developing a keen eye for quality stock. She and Wyatt became true partners in every sense, their relationship built on mutual respect, shared goals, and enduring love. They still took evening walks when weather and duties allowed, still held hands like newlyweds, still surprised each other with small gestures of affection. In 1895, when Daniel was 15, he announced his intention to enter a horse in the county fair. He had been training a young stallion for months, and he was convinced the horse could win the blue ribbon. Julia and Wyatt supported him, though they cautioned that competition was fierce and he should not be too disappointed if he did not win. But Daniel's horse did win, taking first place in the working horse category, and the pride on Wyatt's face as he watched his son accept the ribbon was a beautiful thing to see. Emma, at 13, declared she wanted to go to school in Spokane to study business. Julia's heart broke a little at the idea of her daughter leaving home, but she and Wyatt arranged for Emma to stay with a respectable family during the school term. Emma excelled in her studies, coming home for summers full of new ideas and ambitions. She talked about opening her own business someday, maybe a store or a hotel, something that would let her use her skills with numbers and her talent for organization. Thomas, at 5, was still young enough to be content playing around the ranch, building elaborate structures with blocks and sticks, drawing pictures of horses, and following his older siblings everywhere. He was the baby of the family, doted on by everyone, but he was not spoiled. Julia and Wyatt made sure all their children understood the value of work, of integrity, of treating others with respect. In the autumn of 1896, the Ramsey Ranch celebrated 13 years of Julia's presence. It was not an official anniversary of anything, but Julia felt reflective as she stood in the kitchen of the main house, preparing supper for her family. 13 years since she had arrived in Wallace expecting nothing. 13 years of growth, of learning, of becoming someone she had not known she could be. Wyatt came in from the barn and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" "Just remembering. When I first came here, I was convinced I had nothing to offer. I believed I was worthless. And now," Julia turned in his arms to face him, "now I know better. I know that worth is not measured by any single thing. I am a wife, a mother, a rancher, a bookkeeper, a gardener. I am all of these things and more. But most importantly, I am myself, and that is enough." Wyatt cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "You have always been enough, Julia. From the moment I first saw you, you were enough. I am just glad you finally believe it." Daniel burst through the door with Thomas on his heels, both of them arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to pump water for the horses. Emma followed more sedately, carrying her school books and already calculating something on a piece of paper. The kitchen filled with noise and activity, the comfortable chaos of a family. Julia looked around at the life she had built and felt complete. She thought of the young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in 1883, broken and hopeless, believing her life was over. That woman had been wrong. That woman's life was just beginning, though she could not have known it then. Every hardship, every moment of despair, had led to this. A kitchen full of laughter, a husband who loved her unconditionally, children who were growing into remarkable people, and a ranch that thrived under their combined efforts. She had thought she was barren and worthless, but Wyatt had seen the truth. He had looked at her that first day in the hotel dining room and later in her cabin on Christmas Eve and said, in word and deed, "You are enough for me just as you stand here." And in believing in her, he had helped her believe in herself. The children they had adopted, the miracle baby she had birthed, the life they had created together, all of it was built on that foundation of acceptance and love. As Julia called the family to supper, as they gathered around the table that Wyatt had built years ago, as she served the food she had prepared and listened to her children talk about their days and watched her husband smile at her across the table, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place. She had found her purpose. She had found her home. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Julia and Wyatt sat together on the porch as they had so many times over the years. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain sky and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Wyatt held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you ever regret it?" Julia asked softly. "Marrying me, taking on the challenges, the uncertainty." Wyatt pulled her closer. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best decision I ever made, Julia Ramsey. You and our children, this life we have built, it is everything I could have wanted and more than I ever dreamed possible." "I love you," Julia said, the words simple but weighted with 13 years of meaning. "I love you," Wyatt replied and kissed her under the stars. The ranch continued to prosper in the years that followed. Daniel eventually took over most of the day-to-day training operations, proving himself to be as skilled as his father. He married at 22, a sweet-natured girl from Wallace named Catherine, and they built a house on the ranch property, continuing the family tradition. Emma opened her business in Spokane, a hotel that quickly gained a reputation for excellent management and fair prices. She married at 25, a lawyer named Robert who admired her intelligence and ambition. Thomas, the charmer, bounced between helping on the ranch and working in town at the bank, unable to decide which path he wanted to follow but cheerful in his indecision. Julia and Wyatt became grandparents, first to Daniel and Catherine's children, then to Emma and Robert's. The ranch house filled with the sound of grandchildren, and Julia found herself playing the role of grandmother with the same joy she had found in motherhood. She taught her granddaughters to bake and garden, told her grandsons stories about their father's childhood, and marveled at how life continued to expand and grow in unexpected ways. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1904, Wyatt surprised Julia with a trip. They took the train to San Francisco, a week away from the ranch and the responsibilities, just the two of them exploring the city together. They walked along the waterfront, ate in fancy restaurants, attended a play, and stayed in a hotel with running water and electricity, modern conveniences that amazed them both. On their last night in the city, they stood on the balcony of their hotel room looking out over the lights of San Francisco. Julia leaned against Wyatt's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "Thank you for this. Thank you for everything. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely rancher who did not have the sense to know how lucky he was." "You always knew," Julia corrected. "That was what made me believe you. You saw me clearly, all my flaws and failures, and you chose me anyway. I chose you because I loved you. I still do. I always will." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to continue their life together. The years continued to pass, bringing change and challenge and joy in equal measure. Julia's hair turned gray and Wyatt's beard grew white. Their children raised families of their own. The ranch expanded until it was one of the most successful in Idaho. But through all the changes, the core remained the same. Two people who had found each other when both needed finding, who had built a life based on respect and partnership and enduring love. In 1910, when Julia was 51 years old and had been at the ranch for 27 years, she woke early one morning and walked out onto the porch to watch the sunrise. It was summer, her favorite season, and the mountains were green and the sky was clear. She heard Wyatt moving around inside, making coffee as he did every morning, and she smiled at the familiar sound. He joined her on the porch a few minutes later, handing her a cup of coffee. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Julia thought about the journey she had taken, from despair to hope, from feeling worthless to knowing her value, from being alone to being surrounded by family. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt asked, as he had so many times over the years. Julia smiled. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman alive. I am thinking that I found everything I needed right here in this place with you. I am thinking that the girl who stepped off that stagecoach in 1883 never could have imagined this life, but she would be so proud of the woman I became." Wyatt kissed her temple. "I am proud of you every single day." They stood together watching the sunrise over the mountains, two people who had found each other in the vast wilderness of the American West, who had built something lasting and true. Julia had thought she was barren and worthless, but Wyatt had shown her the truth. She was enough, just as she was. She had always been enough. And together, they had created a life that was more than enough. It was everything. The grandchildren arrived later that morning, as they often did on weekends, filling the house with noise and energy. Daniel came with his family, Emma traveled from Spokane with hers, and Thomas brought his new wife, a spirited woman named Margaret whom everyone adored. The house burst with life and laughter. 3 generations gathered around the table that had seen so many meals, so many conversations, so many moments of connection. Julia looked around the table at her family, at the faces young and old, at the life she and Wyatt had created through faith and hard work and stubborn hope. She caught Wyatt's eye across the table, and he winked at her, that same warm smile he had given her the first day they met. After all these years, after all they had been through together, he still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, and she looked at him the same way because he was. He had been her salvation when she needed it most, not because he rescued her from her circumstances, but because he saw her value when she could not see it herself. He had said she was enough, and in believing him, she had found the strength to become everything she was meant to be. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and her family talked and laughed around her, Julia felt a profound sense of peace. This was her legacy, not the children her body could or could not produce, but the love she had given and received, the family she had built through choice and determination, the life she had created against all odds. She was Julia Ramsey, wife of Wyatt, mother of Daniel and Emma and Thomas, grandmother to 8 beautiful grandchildren, rancher, bookkeeper, friend, and so much more. She was enough. She had always been enough. And that knowledge, hard-won and precious, was the greatest gift of all.